The Learning Center for the Deaf's goal and strategic plan to advance racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. We will be working with educational programs, community programs, audiology, interpreting, research, and other expanded service lines for our racial equity action. This plan presents short and long-term goals and actions aimed at creating a culture that is truly inclusive. This is an initial and therefore dynamic document. New versions will be released as we hold meetings and forums to create change. The strategic plan to advance racial equity, diversity, and inclusion will set a new standard for how we achieve our mission to ensure that all deaf and hard of hearing children and adults will thrive by having the knowledge, opportunity, and power to design the future of their choice. At the Learning Center for the Deaf, all employees, students, families, and clients of color will feel safe, respected, and valued. We acknowledge that racism is rooted in the society in which we live, is present in our organization, and is difficult to uproot. We have much work to do in our commitment to drive racial justice and anti-racism. We are committed to focused work on dismantling racial and systemic inequities for all students and staff. Our goal is transformational social and system change to solidify all the space that we occupy as safe, equitable, inclusive, and respectful. Racism is defined as conduct, words, practices, or policies which advantage or disadvantage people based on their cultural, ethnic origin, or color. Racism is just as damaging in obvious forms as it is in less obvious and subtle forms. It is still called racism, whether intentional or unintentional. Racial justice is a proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for all. Equity is, as an outcome, we achieve racial equity when race no longer determines one's socioeconomic outcomes. When everyone has what they need to thrive, no matter where they live. As a process, we apply racial equity when those most impacted by structural racial inequality are meaningfully involved in the creation and implementation of the institutional policies and practices that impact their lives. Anti-racism is to think noting behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any of the racial groups. To be anti-racist is to de-racialize behavior, to remove the tattooed stereotype from every racialized body. Behavior is something humans do, not races do. The Learning Center for the Deaf, 4 racial equity goals. 1. To create opportunities to meaningfully engage with communities of color. 2. To hire, train, and promote racially diverse and culturally competent workforce. 3. Create an anti-racist culture that is safe, respectful, and inclusive. 4. Allocate resources necessary to advance racial equity. Action Plan for Change. This plan is designed to guide the first steps in our work to dismantle racism within TLC and to build a new culture that advances racial equity. We have divided our action plan to address the 4 levels of change, encompassing both a macro and micro level approach needed to dismantle the 4 forms of racism: structural, institutional, interpersonal, and individual. Structural racism encompasses 3 facets of an organization. 1, the history that allows and perpetuates racism. 2, the culture that allows racism to be normalized and replicated. And 3, the policies that allow racist behavior, intentional or unintentional, to be legitimized. In order to confront and dismantle racism throughout the organization and all programs therein, we present an integrated plan that considers the systems, policies, practices, culture, and individual actions that create and perpetuate racism. This plan presents short and long-term goals and actions aimed at creating a culture that is truly inclusive. This is an initial and therefore dynamic document. New versions will be released as we hold meetings and forums to create change. Program level application: educational programs, community programs, audiology, interpreting, research, and future new or expanded service lines. Through the combined work of an independent consultant, the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer, and leadership team, TLC will create a long-term action plan to address, at minimum, the following topics. Further, TLC will use an evaluation cycle to assess, revise, implement, and track ongoing results in an iterative and ongoing commitment to action and transparency. TLC will hire a leader in implementing strategic initiatives, including the creation of a culture for equity, diversity, and inclusion. Through this role, we will partner with the leaders, faculty, students, staff, and internal and external constituencies to ensure programming and workforce development supports the TLC inclusive values and strategic goals. The position of the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer will report directly to the CEO and serve as a member of our executive leadership team. This role is designed to employ a trauma-informed lens while serving as the organization's diversity and inclusion strategist. Retain a professional consultant to work with the role of the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer and to assess the current culture and organization of TLC and to support the development and implementation of a long-term plan of action to address racial inequities within the organization, inclusive of, at minimum, the following. Survey all constituents, including staff, students, families, alumni, and community members, to determine gaps in racial equity across the organization. Define the current state of organizational structure and operating mechanisms. With a commitment to transparency and accountability, this plan, inclusive of measurable outcomes, will be made public to the TLC community. We will distribute an open invitation to all students, past and present, and invite them to dialogue, led by an independent facilitator, to listen to personal stories and seek recommendations on ways that we can reduce bias, eliminate racism, and promote inclusion and safety for all in our schools. Conduct focus groups and public forums to obtain information about perceived issues and solutions within the community. Identify various assets and barriers for improving all programs at TLC. The CEIO and CEO will meet regularly in an open meeting with staff members who identify as a person of color to seek feedback in a direct line of communication between staff of color and administration. The CEIO will meet monthly in an open meeting with staff members who identify as Black or Indigenous BIPOC to seek feedback in a direct line of communication between staff of color and administration. The Board of Trustees will commit to seats of no less than 25% representation by BIPOC and other marginalized members. Branding of the organization and individual programming will be assessed with BIPOC and other marginalized representatives to ensure diversity that represents the inclusion of all of our community and further advances racial equity. Assess current program policies regarding disciplinary action and academic performance with support of an independent consultant to identify a proactive action plan to address racial inequity. The Learning Center for the Deaf will identify and develop a framework or model of change to align with TLC's mission and core values. This framework will be rooted in transparency and accountability. As such, the Learning Center will adopt a restorative justice model across all levels of the organization. We will do this in 3 ways. A. All leaders will receive training in the restorative justice process. B. HR policies will be amended to include a restorative justice framework. C. We will promote a critical engagement environment that also includes a student-centered space using restorative justice practices. Identify and develop a framework or model of change to align with TLC's mission and core values. This framework will be rooted in transparency and accountability. As such, TLC will adopt a restorative justice model across all levels of the organization. A. All leaders will receive training in the restorative justice process. B. HR policies will be amended to include a restorative justice framework. C. Promote a critical engagement environment that also includes a student-centered space using restorative justice practices. Establish a TLC equity committee. The committee will consist of representatives from the student body, parents, clients, staff, and community members. We have a 3-step plan to attack this. First, a plan will be established to determine the committee size, structure, and meeting frequency. Second, ensure at least 2/3 representation by those that identify as Black, Indigenous, person of color, and other marginalized identities on the equity committee to ensure the inclusion of ideas from diverse points of view. And third, analyze progress and seek inputs on the proposed action plan and outcomes. The leadership team will transparently demonstrate their commitment to learning and growth by engaging in a collective weekly learning exercise on topics of racial equity, and will make public the current resources they are reading or watching to support their efforts to identify ways to improve racial equity at TLC. TLC will review all student policies, including those related to requirements to participate in sports and other activities, and review all dress code requirements. TLC will review all human resource policies to determine where there may be bias and revise accordingly. We will do this by assessing and proposing changes to TLC's hiring practices to diversify equity. All interviews will include at least one Black, Indigenous, person of color during the interview process. TLC will unpack all relevant curriculum to infuse a racial equity framework into how and what we teach. We will write a plan and timeline to replace or revise the curriculum accordingly. We will assess how we celebrate culture and diversity through holiday and other traditions at TLC and make recommendations for improvement. We will establish a mentorship program to increase opportunities for teachers. We will ensure administrators that field trips are and interpreters of color of culturally diverse opportunities. We will write new policies for how the school recognizes diversity in these traditions. Micro-level, interpersonal and individual racism. TLC will establish an expectation of anti-racist commitment. Staff education and professional development will ensure that TLC is committed to and actively practicing the Black Lives Matter movement's 13 principles through interpersonal interaction, social media, and other visible platforms. All staff across all programs will be required to participate in a rigorous professional development, which will focus on topics related to critical social justice lenses. A plan will be developed to retain presenters and educators to lead the development and to establish a calendar and meeting structure. We will create space and supply resources for teachers and staff to do internal work of becoming culturally responsive and critically conscious educators and practitioners. A culture of individual accountability will be realized through the establishment of a reporting process for students and staff that witness or experience racism. A formal policy for responding to complaints of racism will be established to ensure that all staff and students report that they feel safe at TLC. A plan will be written dictating when, how, and who we engage with the police if a student, staff, person, or member of color is involved. A decision process will include a panel of peers. TLC will host public dialogues about the roots of isms and how individuals can become powerful social agents of change. You will see an ongoing agenda for change. This will list the task, the point person, the date implemented, and notes and resources needed for further action. You will see who is responsible for running these programs, when they will be held, if they have been completed, or if they are a work in progress.